So next up, we have Paul Chasson from the San Francisco Planning Department. Paul's going to share insights about transportation design and a lot of the things that he learned about, working with the streets of San Francisco.
Hi. I'd like to thank, before I start, I just want to thank Jenny and Paul for helping me, for inviting me to come tonight. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for all of you for coming out on Tuesday night. So I'm an urban designer. I work at the planning department in San Francisco. My background's in urban planning and landscape architecture. And actually, I think it's a pretty different genre of design. I'm always super curious when I get to hang out with creative professionals or people that sort of do work, call themselves designers, identify as designers, and work in a completely different medium, completely different set of constraints, with these sort of parallel, similar processes, but that are really different too. So sorry, I think the date is totally wrong on that. Didn't fix it. But before I get into what that is and what I do, I'm going to tell you the story about the last time I came to a BayCHI talk. I'm an urban planner. I try to live my own rhetoric. I believe in what that's why I don't own a car. And Jenny invited me down here, and I took Caltrain. And because of the baby bullets, and they don't stop at every station, so I got off at Palo Alto, and there was this dinner thing I had to get to in Menlo Park. And so I was like, no problem. This is great. I'll get to walk from Palo Alto to Menlo Park. And then it's a mile and a quarter. It's just super simple on the map. And so I did it. And it was a pretty amazing walk. You could see this is walking down El Camino. I think this is actually in Menlo Park. This is a nice part where there's a sidewalk over there. And you can get a sense of I don't know. I'm guessing most of you work in this kind of world of software or websites or gizmos that you hold in your hand. And I just I think one of the things that I always think about, I used to do graphic design, and when I started doing graphic design and reading about typography, it changed the way I read magazines and books and print media or looked at websites, And so now it's when I'm walking down streets, I can't turn it off. So I thought we could take a little walk down El Camino together. You can see the ratio of the kind of amount of space for people. There's maybe one person can sort of barely sit on the sidewalk. There's cars whipping by, ostensibly at 35 miles an hour, but it's really hard to actually drive 35 miles an hour on a street like this. Most people are probably doing 45 or 50. You can see this is the first pedestrian I saw. He's hanging out in the middle of the median, marooned on the median over there. This fleet of SUVs whipping past him. And then I got down there, so I'm halfway along, and I see this sign, which I totally ignored by the bus stop over here. And I'm coming, you can kind of see there's this insane intersection where you've got a cross, and there's this kind of pork chop thing where cars can quickly go through. And you get to the end, and then the sidewalk just ceases. It's over. They're sorry, please go back and use the crosswalk. And the crosswalk's like a quarter of a mile away at least. So I've got to go back, cross the road, which itself is an eighth of a mile probably, and then double back. And I was fuck it, I'm not going to do that. And so there's this stretch where I'm you're walking on the street, and it's this calculus. Am I going to go through the street, or am I going to double back? And so then I look behind me, and I'm okay, this seems they're way back there at the light. And so then you get to the Mountain View part. And it's a little bit better. There's a little sidewalk over here, and they've even put some trees in. And this is this made me so happy. You can see they put the tree grates in, and then somebody very thoughtfully made sure the sidewalk was still ADA compliant because you need at least 3 feet. And so there's this a wheelchair user can very gingerly navigate around the trees over here, and they were all up on the Menlo Park side. And then the trees get too big, and the grates have to come out, and it's impossible to use. And so and what's crazy about this is that these are not accidental spaces, right? You kind of are at a place like this, and you're how does this happen? Who comes up with this? But these are just engineered spaces. They're thoroughly vetted. There's fleets of professionals that stamp the drawings and make sure all the standards are being met. And yet we end up with this, and it's like, how does this happen? Like, how does all this stuff get here? And I thought it would just be kind of, interesting to pause and take a step back. This is like Philadelphia from 1904. I'm going to show you a quick movie. I'm not going to show the whole thing, but this is kind of floating around on the blogs. This is like urban planner porn, basically. And this is some footage where it was taken 2 weeks before the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco down Market Street. And these guys were like filming with their camera. And you can see how the street's being used over here. It's, there's horses, pedestrians, occasional bikers, and automobiles. And they're, they're all kind of moving at the same speed, and it was like, this is kind of how our streets used to be, and you can just see how much life and activity there is in the public realm and in the space between the buildings. And part of that is because the technology, you couldn't move that quickly, but part of it is also, the way we build buildings has changed when you think of like elevators and you can't legally build some of the tenements that people used to live in now. And so like the spaces are less efficient and people are more spread out. In fact, when I was in grad school up in Seattle, I remember hearing some statistic, I'm sure it's true here, if not worse, that over the past 50 years, the population of this region had doubled. And the geographic footprint had increased by a factor of 5. Our uses are more separated. We don't work in the same buildings that we live in. We work in our special office buildings and stuff, and everything got spread out. And just the mode of work is really different. We now sit at desks and peck away at computers instead of like delivering the milk, And so there was this natural activity formed by people doing their day-to-day sort of job. That's enough of that one. And just to kind of put it to scale, like here's a medieval Florence on the left, and then on the right, you can see a contemporary Atlanta freeway interchange, this really big freeway interchange. And they're like this, these are to scale drawings, they're the same size, right? So this whole city, this whole like cultural center, like it was like the New York or the Paris of its day can fit into the same amount of space that we have a highway, on-ramp. It's crazy. So this is like, when I get into like what urban design actually is, and it's like, I think it's different. There's some ways that it's different from the design that I imagine most of the people here sort of do. You're dealing with, and it's different-ish. I'm sure that there's a lot of parallels, but like you're dealing with very complex social systems as well as these physical systems. And so we're not just dealing with the geometry of the street, and how people may be using that, but there's people's ideas about class, there's race and class and these like very thorny sort of social issues, people's ideas about home, which are one of the places where they draw meaning from in their own lives. You're dealing with three-dimensional space, which isn't like, what makes it really different than something like this is like you're surrounded by this space. You can approach the space different ways. You have a lot less control about how people enter and access the space, and you're sort of in the space, and then it's all kind of tied up in this messy process of like policy and politics, and these democratic processes. So like one of the things that urban planners do is we help people come to these like really, or large groups of people come to really complicated decisions, which are often sort of binary. So how are we going to choose how we're going to design a place, or how high the buildings are going to be, or what can go there? Ends up, there's no way to get consensus in a place like San Francisco. There's like it's tens of thousands of people living in a neighborhood. It's like really diverse. And so how do you legitimize a process to make a decision about what should happen? And then there's also economic interests and stuff. When you get into streets, you sort of like can zoom down. Like there's some basic functions that streets need to provide. There's commerce and retail, you need to be, and I apologize, this is the first time I've ever given this presentation. I was kind of like typically procrastinating last minute. So ideally there'd be like little pictures of like the commerce and retail, but that's okay. You guys can use your narrative imaginations. But you can imagine like, so if you think of a commercial street with a bus line on it, all the functions that that street needs to accommodate, you've got to make sure the merchants can get to the thing. You've got accessibility, and then especially for like people on wheelchairs or people with vision impairments or disabilities, mobility impairments, and the fire department's got to be able to get there in an emergency. You've got just the actual mobility function of getting people to and from the place. You've got all this kind of fuzz, right? Like all this stuff that sort of accretes, like the striping on the road and the signs and like the engineering stuff that you'd have that sort of just tends to like congregate in a place. And then this whole other sort of realm of like place, right? People, this is someone's home. This is somewhere that hopefully somebody cares about, and these kind of like more ethereal social goals of like encouraging social interaction, encouraging empathetic moments and so forth, and beauty, right? And then like into this, the process is slow and expensive and high risk. If we design a street, if you design a software app and it fails, like maybe it doesn't sell and you can change it, it's not that complicated. I mean, it's complicated, I'm sure, but like if you design a street and it fails, people get injured, like people get hurt, people get sued. And so, and there are like millions of dollars in capital expenses, and people's political legacies are tied up in this idea of it. And so there's just a lot of like thorny stuff that has to be navigated to make streets. And just to kind of give you a sense of the scale of it, like in San Francisco, and this is actually true for cities and suburbs, even though the street patterns are different, the numbers are relatively similar, 25 to 30% of the city is public rights-of-ways. And so in San Francisco, it's 25%, almost to the T. And a lot of them are like this one. This is, I think, either oak or fell. And you can see it's like largely just a utilitarian space, mainly used for moving and storing vehicles. And it could be a lot more. 25%, it's more than all the parks in the city combined, more than Golden Gate Park and the Presidio and all that. I think just another idea about why they're sort of important. I remember when I was in college, you'd hear Al Gore on NPR, and he'd be telling us the internet was like kind of still pretty new, and it was like chat rooms. I remember my professors would like make me like go to chat rooms in the class, and it was like they were like the internet is going to be all about democracy. Like no one had figured out how to make money on it yet. It was going to be go to chat rooms, and you would like there'd be this great civic commons, and because we had now the internet, like place wasn't gonna matter anymore. You could like go fishing in your little cabin in Montana, and you could like log in on the internet and do your work, and so you could live anywhere. But actually, it's been the opposite that's been true, and that we find that now that place, like you used to work in, Texas because there was oil there, or there would be like wheat to harvest in the Midwest or whatever it was. But like now that place doesn't matter. Place is the only thing that sort of matters. It's the San Franciscos and the New Yorks of the world that are the most successful places because anyone can sort of go there. Another reason to care about this is just the public health epidemic that we have in this country because of our unsafe streets. They are by far and away the largest cause of death of children, youth, and teenagers, or car accidents, or car crashes, actually. I try not to use the word accidents. I don't have a slide of it, but there's also climate change. If we want to solve global warming, making dense, walkable urban places is like intrinsic to that strategy. And so here's a sort of suburban street pattern. I don't know, a lot of the Bay Area looks like this, and this is kind of a more urban street pattern. I sort of work and operate in places like this. I just kind of wanted to say, like, I know sometimes people, when you start talking about this stuff, people sometimes get sensitive. They hear, like, if depending on where they live, that you're making value judgments. I'm going to be talking about places like San Francisco. These kinds of places are very hard to retrofit to make into places like this. Just structurally, the bones are very different. So in San Francisco, we've got a bunch of tools that we're using to sort of try and help reimagine the potential for our streets. One of them, this is a website I actually created when I first started working at the planning department. It's the Better Streets Plan. And within it, there's a whole bunch of kind of how-to guides, project types. Over here, you can kind of sort of see the fine project types. And those are, in addition to sort of design guidelines, we set up a bunch of street types in the city, and people could sort of say, instead of like a collector arterial, it's like a neighborhood commercial street. So try to redefine what they are, and we have design guidelines for them. But there's also, we mapped out for all these relatively simple processes. I want to get a tree, I want to get a bench in my neighborhood, and there's all the process, and there's who you have to call to, and just sort of try to encourage this sort of bottom-up placemaking. We also have the Parklet program. If you guys have questions about this, I'm not going to be talking about this tonight, but I used to manage this program. which is also sort of part of this process of democratizing the public space. This is a Living Innovation Zone program. I don't know if any of you have seen this thing. This is this new program I'm sort of trying to kickstart. Also, I'm not going to talk about it tonight, but if you have questions about it, it's about showcasing the city's creativity to date. We've only built one bit, kind of, this is that. We are putting in protected bike lanes. We're putting in bike share. All of this, here's sidewalk landscaping and with some stormwater benefit. And so over time, these kinds of treatments, this is the new rainbow crosswalks that we just put in on Castro Street. Got a nasty letter, the city traffic engineer from the FTA, and thankfully he ignored it, and so now we have, you can't do that, it's a non-standard crosswalk. So that's basically like, there's a whole bunch of stuff we're trying to do. One of them I'm going to talk about tonight are shared streets. But just before we get into that, just like basically within street design, these are like kind of the toolkit of parts that you have to work with. And I think one of the main things to think about with streets is, like, if there's one universal design truth, it's that, we are humans, and the scale of our bodies, the scale of space to our bodies is nothing that you can sort of change, right? So we have there's this idea of the urban room, which is basically the building heights that frame the space should be roughly, it's this classic Roman measure of like about as tall as the street is wide, or maybe half to as tall as the street is wide. There's also walls by the buildings. There's a floor and what that is. There's street furniture like benches and bike racks and so forth. There's lighting, trees, and then all the engineering stuff we talked about. So here's like a pretty urban space, right? You can get a sense of what it feels like to be in this space. Here's the downtown New York. It's like very fancy, but you can kind of get a sense, like this is the ratio of sidewalk to, it's designed to move quite a few people relative to the few cars in there. This is, I think, Paris. Yeah, and here's a really wide street, but one of the things that's happening here on this side is that even though the street is like too wide for people, these trees kind of come in the middle and they sort of help frame the space. And so they humanize it, and they kind of, you now sort of have with free height this kind of nice urban room that's sort of created. They kind of define walls. This is a little alley. This is how most streets were initially designed before cars, like a totally different, intimate, sort of scaled space. And this is, I think, La Rambla. Once again, the trees kind of sort of just framing it and helping define it. These are like exquisite examples. It's just where the architecture and the ground plane and all of it sort of comes together. These were making the urban planning blogs recently. These are, you can kind of see in a suburban landscape, you don't have the same kind of wall. You don't have the same kind of sense of enclosure. Over here, here's another one, like of what these. So this is like kind of a more challenging space to sort of trying to fix. So the big idea, this is like the shared street part. They're called lunars or living streets or home zones. We call them shared public ways in San Francisco. And I think this is a nice little case study. I was trying to think about how to make this talk like meaningful for people that, for you guys who are in a pretty different, who aren't really architects. And like, I think one of the things that I think about a lot in the city is just how to get stuff done. You're working in this bureaucracy, in this system which is by design slow and conservative and risk averse. And I think this is a nice case study of both from the big idea design sort of part to like the implementation. And so with shared streets, just basically this started with an idea. I actually had an internship before I went to grad school at the place I work now, and there's this guy that I'll show you in a second who came and gave a PowerPoint while we were doing the Market Octavia plan, a bunch of like rezoning and public space designing around Market Octavia, and he gave this PowerPoint, and we were like, that's cool, let's put it in the plan. And so one of like the big powers that we have at the planning department is this sort of rhetorical power. We have these police powers, we have the zoning code, and we can sort of make people do things, enforcement. But we also have this idea as like, we are the state, and when we put an idea in our documents, people take them seriously in a way that they don't if you're like an advocate. So we put this little blip in about this thing, and then the plan took like a decade to adopt. And then in the plan, there was this idea for shared streets. So have any of you seen the blue bottle on, I can show it to you. But anyway, so then there was a pilot project built. We then wrote the Better Streets plan, which I spoke about a second ago. And now we're kind of at this point where like we've within this city bureaucracy, like institutionalized this idea, there's all these like technical details to sort of work out. And so Lansing Street is this, I'll show you really fast. I'll show you in a second. But anyway, so Lansing Street is the one that I'm working on that I'm going to show you about. But the big idea here, what a shared street actually is, it was in the 1970s, and this was, I guess it was 1982. This guy, Hans Monderman, was a traffic engineer in a little town in the Netherlands. And there was a budget crisis. There had been some recent traffic accidents. There was people upset about it. And he basically had this idea that like, they couldn't afford to do the traffic engineering stuff they wanted to do. So he basically stripped away all the signs, all the markings, all the cues that you sort of are normally given to know how to navigate a space. And the idea is that like most people don't want to crash into people and kill people. And if you think about how you normally behave in a street where you're like given everything to do on a plate, you know, you've got these stripes on it and you've got signs and you have this threat of coercion where if you don't follow the rules, you're going to get a ticket or you're going to go to jail or whatever will happen. And so this guy basically took all that stuff away, and so people don't know what to do. It creates intentional ambiguity, and they kind of like inch forward through the space and crawl through at a sane speed. So to give you like kind of, and then this guy who gave this PowerPoint, this is this guy Ben Hamilton. Unfortunately, when you Google him, he's like totally like eclipsed by some football player. But the guy in the top right is the guy who I saw, and he's like was an architect who got a Rhodes Scholar, went and studied these spaces. I totally actually empathize with him. If you Google me, there's this plastic surgeon who's like the most cliched, like douchebag plastic surgeon in San Diego, and he crushes me in the Google rankings. But so here's a Woonerf. Here's a Dutch Woonerf. You know, you can see there's no curbs. There's some really nice paving. You pave the space so basically it feels like a plaza, and the driver feels like they're a guest in a pedestrian space. Oftentimes there might be even like kids play equipment, you know. So just in a similar way, you would never do like 50 miles an hour in a parking lot or an alley. Like it's not a space that you would move quickly in. Here's an intersection. It's a really clever little design. It's sort of like a traffic circle. It's like a sort of a bulge, mogul in the middle of the street. You know, and some people might treat this and go around it and treat it like a traffic circle. Some people might kind of roll over it, but you know, no one really knows what to do. But when people come to the intersection, they sort of it relies on sort of these very like basic human ways of interacting. Like, do you ever have the sensation when you come to a stop sign and you get there at the same time as somebody else, and there's this through like this a glance through the most tiniest like flash of like of a look at someone, you can exchange permission for one of you to like move forward and go ahead, right? You know, and so that's happening. Here's another intersection. There's a big YouTube video about this. The Ben Hamilton guy designed. This used to have like multiple lanes approaching. They knocked it down to one lane. You can kind of see there's some like ADA texture stuff, but it's basically like a free-for-all, and it's totally like traffic moves through smoothly. And like they've actually built whole towns like this in Europe where cars can kind of crawl through at 10 miles an hour, and they find that the cars actually even make it through at the same speed because they're not stopping and like being penalized for the stop signs. So here's another before and after. It's not a great image, sorry, kind of rated it. I think it's in Australia. And then this is Exhibition Road. It's a big street in London with all the museums. You can kind of see a before and after picture here. And you can see there's some, this detail over here is a more graceful way of what I'm about to show you, what I'm working on now in San Francisco. Kind of just get a sense of the space. You can see there's still cars in it, but it's really a space for people, and it's really being used. And this is a little attempt that was done in San Francisco. This is Linden Alley. So my colleague David Winslow, at the time he was an architect, and he like read the Market Octavia plan and got inspired. He was working in an architecture office above it, and this little stretch at the end of an alley in Hayes Valley, he got converted to a space. And this was the first kind of one that we'd done in a long while. And you can kind of see this. You know, it's actually like a pretty irregular space. There's like these yellow truncated domes. I'll explain what that means in a sec. But there's and it's seesaws, and so a lot of these kind of all these barriers to the sidewalky part were intended to help people with disabilities help navigate it. And they've actually, when they took them out there, they didn't like it at all. So this is like an example of us taking a baby step toward implementing it. You can get a better sense of the scale of it over there. Like a third of an alley. And so my project that I'm working on is Lansing Street. Before I started working on it, there's a Halloween party at the planning department. This is I dressed up as yellow truncated domes. I'm kind of obsessed with this material. And we have this, this is where like the bureaucracy will sort of crush projects like this. We have this, this guy at the Department of Public Works whose job it is when somebody sues the city, if somebody's injured, to stand up in court and say, this is compliant, and he stamps off on everything. And so he basically had been insisting on this whole stretch over here on the sidewalk part. This is the reason I say park, there's no curbs in the streets, there's no sidewalk, the metaphor breaks down a bit, to require this fluorescent yellow bumpy material. And so if your whole point is like intentionally ambiguity, you literally crashes into the ADA, which requires, it's this hyper regimented, like this is the wheelchair space and this is the car space, and this sort of strict segregation of spaces. And when you put a 3-foot fluorescent stripe down the center of it, it kind of kills the whole thing. So we haven't really been able to build these in San Francisco, and other cities are sort of doing them. And so this project is actually on Harrison Street and Lansing Street. This is a little alley, but on the other side is Harrison. And this is a parcel over here with a skyscraper that's going up. And the Planning Commission had sort of said to them that as part of their conditions of approval, that they, in order to meet their open space requirements, had to build this as a living street, like what we said. So we had a lot of power to make them do it. So after we did this whole plan of contest with the fire department and so forth, they came to us with this where they took out like half the trees and they had these yellow domes everywhere. And we wrote them back something like this, and we said, this is what we want the street to look like. And they were like, we can't do that. We're like, we'll help you get through fire, we'll help you get through ADA. And this is also something where like a lot of what we do as designers in the city, we do some design, but a lot of it is like trying to extract good design in the public realm from other designers or push them or like critique other people's designs. And when I sort of made this promise to them, I had like no idea like what I was actually taking on. We work with the Mayor's Office on Disability and the ADA coordinator to sort of design a process. And this is, I guess, the other thing that we really do is like we sort of do all this process, and the process legitimizes our projects. And so in this case, me and an intern built this tactile model. This is a model that was built out of like sandpaper and felt, and it's really designed to be touched. And we took it to the California Council of the Blind. This is kind of a detachable legend. I was going to bring it, but it's at work. I couldn't get in there today. But it's this sort of touchy-feely model to try to explain how you can explain architectural space to people who can't see, which is actually like not so easy. And we spent like $150 out of pocket on this, and spent a lot of time trying to make a really nice thing. And the intent of it was like probably less useful as a tool to show, to explain how the space worked, but it was really useful as a gesture to like say, we take what you're thinking seriously. And like to create basically an empathetic sort of moment between these sort of users. So basically, like this is Linden Alley. Starts a little, not the best. I should have probably done this before, but this is Linden Alley. This is where the space is. You can kind of see over here. I'm lost in my drawing. This is the alley over here. Sorry, this site is where the skyscraper is going in. Over here, and it's this alley over here, this sort of N-shaped alley that's that we're going to design. You can get a sort of a more cartoon drawing of it over here. And this is like close to the latest design. There's one in between. We pushed really hard to use this material, and we didn't end up getting it. It was too radical for the city of San Francisco, though Seattle and Chicago have done it. And so, but we did get the guy to agree to charcoal gray truncated domes, this charcoal gray strip, which is like kind of a minute, like tiny victory. There's a similar process of like angst with the fire department, but we sort of have gotten them to sign off on this like super narrow street. For those of you that follow San Francisco news, there's this big battle where they're insisting on 20 feet of right of way, and so you kind of sort of blew up of like what the design looks like, and this will be built probably in a couple of years. So that's basically shared streets. I guess the interesting thing I think for you guys is just that this idea of like removing all the design cues, and creating intentional ambiguity, which is like a super simple concept, but like took a major sort of kind of rhetorical sort of semantic shift. So, and then if people have questions about that or pavement of parks or parklets or some of the other stuff too, I'm happy to answer them.
Hello. Hey. I'm just curious if you've been to downtown San Jose, because like First and Second Street over there, it's a shared street. They don't have really that many signs up and everything, and they got really wide walkways, and you feel like you have to do the same thing where you have to be really cautious while you're driving down the street because you don't know what's happening if you're driving over train tracks or something like that.
Does it work? I'm not familiar with it, but
it totally works.
yeah, this is actually like a classic San Francisco thing where I think sometimes in San Francisco we feel like it becomes its own echo chamber, you know, and so other places have solved this, but because we're San Francisco, we make it twice as long, take twice as long, and are a lot more complicated. I mean, I think the other thing too, I think, which is kind of interesting about some of this stuff is that, it's less about the actual design. It's about getting the bureaucracy and the entities in the city to sort of like come along. Working in a city like San Francisco the skills you need are like coalition building, you know. So it's about getting the fire department and the ADA guy and the maintenance people to sort of like get their heads around it, which is the big challenge. But that's amazing. It's great.
Hello. So I'm sure a lot of us deal with the design cues are very important, and like affordances for how to actually use products, gizmos, etc. So in some of your examples, it looked like the streets and such had been made very much more accessible or visibly more attuned for the pedestrians, like the pattern of the sidewalk, or not the sidewalk, the concrete and all that looked much more like a plaza, like you said. Yeah. What I'm wondering is, without the cues, though, how do you know that at surface or that area is even a street anymore? I actually didn't know that you had converted that the Hayes Valley area. I've been there. I didn't actually know that was a street. I thought that was just a big walkway now. So that's, I guess my question is, how do you maintain the fact that it is still a usable street when you don't have the signage or the other traditional cues, and you might just have pedestrians all over it, kind of blocking it? Because
cars are still on it. I mean, if it wasn't a street, then to remove cars from it, and you get into state legal issues, it's actually not so easy to do that. But when there still may be an occasional car meandering through. And I guess it's more, I think that whether or not it's a street is less important as like what kind of place it feels like to be in. You know, if it's a street that feels like a really great place, and then it's successful. But we're more concerned with like just trying to make a really engaging place for people to discover it on their own.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. I love seeing all these inspiring things, and they're streets that I'd love to hang out on. But it seems like there's this amazing willingness that's grown up to reimagine how public streets are used. But the thing is, what I wonder is, why is it that we take for granted the street layout or just the designation of what is street and non-street when it was laid down in another era that had other needs and transport modes? You know, in other words, if we really were designing, we could step back and say, well, what portion of city even needs to be streets? And I guess I should, reveal my cards and say, I tend to think, well, we have housing crises in San Francisco, San Jose, and a bunch of cities. And given that, why would we not consider reclaiming a portion of this 20 to 40% of the city's public space for what seems to be the most urgently needed now?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things packed in there. So one is, answer your question, is that there's a huge legal framework. There's still people that need access. There's fire, there's utilities. There's a lot of other things that may be driving, how, sorry, pun, but like, that may be like pushing how these spaces are used that it's have the power to remove it. But that said, we're actually, one of the things we are hyper uptight about is not wanting to give up public rights away. We'll get, not so much for housing, but we'll get proposals once in a while, a little group of residents will want to like block off an alley, and these are sort of public goods, and we don't know how they're going to be needed or used in the future. I think with housing, the best way to address the housing crisis would be to build denser or more intensive housing on the sites we already have for it. Around transit. There's places like Gary Street which could certainly take a lot more density. given the width and transit that moves through there.
Hi. I was just curious about what opportunities do you have to follow up with your design and gauge its success? Like, do you have a metric for success? If it's just like a feeling, or like, how do you know that the space you built is successful?
Yeah, no, that's really good. One of the things we started doing is there's a whole, the group I work for is like this urban design group in the planning department. So we started doing post-occupancy evaluations or pre-occupancy evaluations. The pre-design, we'll start doing pedestrian counts and bike counts to sort of understand how people are using the space. We'll look at plazas and map out how people are, where people are standing, like what they're doing in the space. Are they standing? Are they lying? Are they talking to each other? Are they waiting for the bus, or so on? And then we'll do that afterwards and watch. There's, on the Living Innovation Zone, on that thing with the whisper dishes that the Exploratorium built, we've put up sensors that can map people, how they're using the space. And so they'll sort of sniff your cell phone. And it's like, they're used, I think, initially like designed for like Walmarts, where you'll be able to move the products around the store, but we can now sort of get a sense of where people are lingering and how they're moving through space. And so this is this new sort of wave of technology that's actually making that, automating that, because doing bike and pedestrian counts is slow and cumbersome. But there's a lot of interest in that.
So thanks for the very intriguing talk. I got a question for, like, the technology nowadays is sort of changing how people walk. People are walking on their phone. People are walking really fast. Is there any thinking on intentionally like slowing people down by designing street in a different way?
There's a lot of thought in slowing cars down. Like we had, but for people, no. Like we had a bunch of BMW engineers come and they wanted to meet us and they wanted to talk about learn about the future of the city so they could design cars. And it was kind of this awkward conversation because we were like, the future of the city is that we're going to make it increasingly a pain in the ass to drive and own a car. We're going to take away spaces to park your car, and we're going to make you drive like 10 miles an hour. Like, and they're like, it's like we don't. I mean, I think the future is is creating spaces where people can meander and not risk getting injured.
Thank you.